First my feet were broken, then my ankles. After that it was my shins. The cudgel's next targets were my knees, shattering them as well. I screamed, of course. I screamed with the first blow, and I screamed with each additional one. How could any man being broken on the wheel not? I wasn't even aware that the executioner had sliced open my arm so that my mangled bones could be braided to the spokes of the wheel. It wasn't until the wheel was lifted and I was suspended by my broken arms that I understood that this had happened, but the pain no longer mattered. Among the countless genres of literature, there exists a tiny subgenre called parallel novels. These are books which take old works by different authors and tell them differently, maybe set in the present day or from the point of view of a different character. Both Wicked, spun off from The Wizard of Oz, and The Looking-Glass Wars, a dark deconstruction of Alice's adventures in Wonderland, are examples of this type of work. So, back in 1816, a woman and her lover, later husband, were visiting Lord Byron in Switzerland, where they were often stuck inside due to rain. They spoke on many varying subjects in science and the supernatural. Among these topics was galvanism, a phenomenon where a corpse will move if stimulated with electricity. The woman soon after had a waking dream of a man working with the unhallowed arts to bring a massive body to life. This woman was Mary Shelley, and it was this image that inspired her now famous work, Frankenstein. To summarize, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, is about Victor Frankenstein, a scientist who seeks to create life by sewing together the parts of many dead bodies, then blasting it with electricity. Dr. Frankenstein succeeds, but soon comes to regret his actions, with his monster turning against him. Though he defies the laws of nature, Frankenstein is generally treated sympathetically, as a flawed hero who seeks to remedy his mistakes. But what if he wasn't? What if Frankenstein were a real man, Shelley having written it based off of this story, while Frankenstein were not so innocent, but a cruel madman who destroys the lives of others for the sake of his own experiments? In Dave Zelsterman's novel, the story is told not by Victor Frankenstein, but by the monster itself, containing the brain of one Frederick Hoffman. This is Monster. The novel opens on Frederick Hoffman, a chemist, being broken on the wheel for his part in the murder of his fiancée, Johanna Clemen. He believes himself innocent, but the blood on his sleeves and a locket in hand disagree with him. He blacks out, thinking of how he will see his beloved again, only to awaken in the lab of Doctor Victor Frankenstein, in the body of an 8-foot-tall monstrosity. Monster closely mirrors the plot of Shelley's original novel, following Frederick as he escapes and roams the German countryside, only to find himself entangled in the plots of Frankenstein, here working with an infamous ally, the Marquis de Sade himself. Now, if you have ever seen the 1931 movie Frankenstein, be aware of this. It is almost nothing like the original novel. The premise, mad scientist creates a monster and regrets it, and the moral, do not interfere with God's domain, are the same, but the plot varies greatly. The support characters are different, and even Frankenstein's own name is changed. In the original, he was called Victor, but for the movie this was changed to called Henry for unclear reasons, which becomes even more confusing when you consider that in the original book, Frankenstein's best friend was Henry Clerval. And it just gets weird when it comes to parodies and homages to the 1931 film, which tend to go back to Victor. While it is never stated explicitly, it can be assumed that Monster is inspired by the book and not the movie due to the story matching more closely, the absence of Frankenstein's hunchbacked assistant Fritz, and the presence of Henry Clerval. Interestingly, Monster does not come across as just a parody or deconstruction of Frankenstein, but more like an homage. The kinds of details that Zelsterman goes into with the story, showing how these same events might have happened if the monster were actually good-hearted, fit into the events as they were presented in the original story. I got the impression while reading it and doing my research that Zelsterman had to have read Frankenstein through at least once, if not several times. There are so many mean-spirited remakes of famous works out there. It's a nice breath of fresh air to see an author who seems to genuinely love the source material. Besides doing his work with the original novel, Zelsterman also did his research while writing. I mentioned that Dr. Frankenstein here works with the Marquis de Sade, the namesake of sadism. Well, the timeline matches up. The Marquis was incarcerated from 1803 until his death in 1813. Shelley had finished writing in 1817, and it suggests that the book took place sometime before that. Then, while traveling in the German countryside, Frederick meets Samuel Hahnemann, most well known for inventing homeopathy. Despite being a load of bull, it's still interesting to see this dive into something different. Maybe I'm just a sucker for these kinds of kisses with history, but it also shows just how in-depth the author went with his research. Hell, there's mention of a town called Aibling, which is today called Bad Aibling, renamed in 1895 for its hot springs. It's minimal, but some authors fail to get even the smallest facts correct. I will get to you later. Dave Zelsterman is known as a thriller writer, and this is indeed where he shines, expressing the terrible acts committed and showing the internal conflict that Frederick feels between his morals and his desire for revenge against Frankenstein for ruining his life. This does not, however, mean that the author is perfect. One of the major missteps is Zelsterman's attempts at pathos. Several times there appears to be attempts to tug at the reader's heartstrings as Frederick bemoans for his lost love and cries at the story told by another of Frankenstein's victims. Had Frederick been not so quick to cry in Monster, it might have been easier to pity the characters for what has happened to them, but instead it feels as though the author is reaching out, grabbing you by the shoulders and screaming, "Cry, damn you!" So, the question becomes, does this weakness in the writing ruin the rest of the work? And to that I reply, no. Though it is very distracting when it occurs and interrupts the escapism aspect, it's fairly minor compared to the rest of the book and grows to be less of a problem as the book advances. Monster has a strong focus on internal conflict rather than external conflict. This makes for strong characterizations of Frederick and Frankenstein. This also means that external events get the shaft on occasion. In particular, the Marquis de Sade just kind of gets shoved aside near the end, and Frankenstein and the Marquis' plan is never fully explained, only suggested to be related to one of the Marquis' books. Despite the weaknesses of the storytelling, this was one of the better books I've read recently. The genre most closely resembles thriller crossing over into psychological horror. At its heights, it reminds me of Stephen King, especially in The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon and Firestarter. It might not be as consistently good, but it certainly has its strengths.